Good morning. Thanks everybody for coming out. And this is great to see people, not virtually, not on a screen somewhere. I love it. I'm John Giuliano. I'm the president of VMC Group. I've been a member of AHR going on 25 years now, mostly with TC 2.7, seismic and wind restraint, which we've also just been burdened with add and flood and add flood language to the book. I've been involved with seismic shake testing, seismic certification of products for probably going on 20 years now. And we've done tons of shake testing, we've been involved with tons of shake testing. And we're gonna get into the big question of seismic certification of motors. Learning objectives, these were actually just copied from John, so none of this will be in my presentation if you're interested. This is what we're going to be discussing. One of the things when we were asked to do this, first of all, I'm assuming people can hear me back there, right? Our TC was asked to come and speak at TC 1.11 because there's so much ambiguity in whether or not motors have to be tested. And motor manufacturers are being told everything. You have to, you don't have to, they're exempt, they're rugged, they're light, they're heavy, whatever. And there's reasons for that. I'm going to go over that. So we're going to try to answer when and which motors are required to be shake tested. When do motors not have to be tested, which is important. If you're a manufacturer, you want to know you may not have to invest some kind of money. Which code provisions are we going to look at? And for site specific and which for product line. There are differences when you're doing your whole product line to certify or just you need something for one project. You finally got a job in California or something. I know electric motors and HVAC equipment, they do present a conundrum, and it's part of it is the language of special seismic certification. I'm going to go through the language. I know generally people don't like to just go up there and recite the words on the page. There's going to be a few pages I will, because we really have to read the verbiage in the language, and the problem with engineers trying to be lawyers. And that adds to the confusion. You guys are being told you have to, you're being told you're exempt, you're being told you don't have to. And there's different... All right, John, did the short circuit blow?
Yes. I'll go fix it right away.
Do we get any feedback on whether the virtual people, or whatever? Anyway, and then I'll go through the jurisdictional requirements of who is dictating what has to be done. But before I want to get into this, we've through the years, those of us on TC 2.7, when we go and talk about the code, we are blamed for the code. But we aren't the writers of the code. So I have two simple rules. First one, please don't shoot. I'm just bringing you the news, like it or not, this is what it is. I'm not involved with writing it. I don't think anyone on TC 2.7 really gets too involved with that. But if you're a motor manufacturer and you've been told you don't have to, and I get you angry because now you think you have to and spend some money, please remember rule number one. Don't shoot the messenger, I'm just trying to relay the information. All right, so now we'll start we have to define what special seismic certification is. And here's the one time when we really got to read what's in the code. And through the decades, prior to ASC 716, there's been other ASC 7s. IBC 2000 was the first one that really started pushing this. But this, I know ASC 722 is probably being delivered now to people's desks. But this would be the most current verbiage. And I'm going to just read that paragraph number one. Active mechanical and electrical equipment that must remain operable. I underline that, it's important. John's presentation talked about life safety from the equipment blowing up and hurting the user. It didn't have to be operable. This has to be operable for life safety. It's more that the equipment functions after an event so people can evacuate the building. The fire sprinklers can work, the garage doors can open up. So the building still has to function as a building to get people out, or if it's a hospital, to still be a hospital. So in this code requirement, the equipment has to remain operable. It says, following the design earthquake, ground motion shall be certified by the manufacturer as operable, whereby active parts or energized components shall be certified exclusively on the basis of shake table testing. And this is now where engineers trying to be lawyers, because in the same sentence, it says, or experience data. Wait, is it exclusive, or do I have an option? So it makes it a little ambiguous as somebody's reading it. And then unless the equipment can be shown inherently rugged. And in general, motors are assumed to be rugged. They're very heavy, you can drop them, pick them back up, put them in, they're gonna keep working. So the assumption is from a motor manufacturer, oh, this says I don't have to do it. Which if I was a motor manufacturer, I would read it and stop here also. But there's more to it than that. First of all, we've got two different terms, equipment and components. So now if we step back and think about it, your motor is a component within a piece of equipment. So now we reword this thinking, well, my motor is not the equipment, my motor is a component. So now I'm part of that second sentence, whereby active parts and energized components are certified exclusively. So now they're going within the box. So we've got this big piece of equipment, and within that box is my motor. Now the code is talking about what's inside your box, or the box that your equipment, your component is going into. Still going on, and so now I'm going to go back here. All right. Yeah. So the opening line, the opening bullet underneath the section 13.2, special certification requirements for designated seismic systems. So I want to go over what that means to you. Well, designated seismic systems, those non-structural components that require design in accordance with chapter 13, right, where the ISA-P is greater than 1.0. And now the ISA-P is the importance factor of the part, which in this case, the part is the equipment. And the confusion lies with this ISA-P is because it's not ISA-B. In the code, there's 3 ISA-Bs, which is for the building, and only 2 ISA-Ps for the component, which is 1 or 1.5. If it's 1.0, you don't need to deal with it. If it's 1.5, that defines that that equipment has to be functional after the earthquake. And it goes on to say that that importance factor, ISA-P, has to be assigned, all components shall be assigned a component importance factor, and it's taken as 1.5 if any of these apply. And the one we're talking about is it's required to function for life safety purposes after an earthquake. So once again, we have a little more ambiguity. So it's a component importance factor, not an equipment importance factor. But now, so your motor is not assigned the ISA-P, the equipment is assigned the ISA-P. So more confusion, here component equals equipment. So I can understand why everybody gets confused. It's been this way for many years. Sometimes component and equipment is interchangeable, sometimes they're distinctly different. But in this particular paragraph, the component is the equipment. It's assigned to the air handling unit in the roof, the power generator or whatever it may be, and the internal parts to that are the components. All right, so now the engineer on the job will go through that component importance factor and assign the ISA-P to all the equipment. And the motors are not generally listed as part of the designated seismic system. The equipment that your motor is put into is listed as part of the designated seismic system. And the listed equipment is what needs to be tested through a product line, or those few exemptions that are there with the or, even though it's exclusively. And now as a manufacturer of the equipment manufacturer is going to decide, well, do I just want to certify my one box? But I make 10 size boxes. So I want a product line certification. So they can go through that ahead of time before that job comes up and get their product line certified. Testing of one size is allowed, but only that size becomes what you're certified. Meaning that if you have your product line range of 10 sizes, you can't test one and say all 10 are gonna survive the earthquake. Luckily, the code allows, you don't have to test all 10. You don't have to test every iteration, every combination, because then the test labs will be billionaires and you guys will be broke. Now, per the testing standard, which I'll discuss later, the equipment must be functional before and after the earthquake. So now think about it. This equipment that your motor is in, I have to test functionality. I have to prove that it worked after shaking. If your motor wasn't in there, I won't be able to turn it on. So now, your motor may not be required to be tested, per se, but it's got to be in the box to be tested, otherwise I can't turn on the box. So now you got to think, well, do I have to test my motor? It depends. So now, like, the motor must be installed in the equipment, and the equipment provided to the job must be manufactured as tested, or tested as manufactured. The way you build it in your factory is the way it has to be tested. And then once it's done, and I'm not going to get into the details, the label does get applied to the equipment which has your motor in it. So your motor, even though it's part of the test, is not technically certified independently. It's certified as part of that equipment that has a label on it. All right, the enforcement of this, when IBC 2000 first came out, most of the manufacturers were like, well, don't ask, don't tell. There was no enforcement, nothing was out there. The AHJs didn't have much knowledge on the subject either, and so it was just ancient certificates of compliance were floating around. But that's one of the times, many times it happens, the code drives what happens in the industry, and the industry lags a little behind. And that happened when IBC 2000 first came out, probably for the first 5-6 years, until California decided to adopt the International Building Code. And once they adopted it, they had already had a department. Well, first I gotta pause a second. I'm gonna go back and forth between OSHPD and HCAI. If anybody's familiar with OSHPD, Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development, they just changed their name to healthcare something or other. And most people in the industry for years are still gonna say OSHPD. It just rolls off the tongue. HCAI doesn't roll off the tongue. So excuse me in advance if I go back and forth. I'm gonna try, but. All right, so anyway, they've had an office already set up to review plans and specs and equipment and ratings of such of what comes in, because their jurisdiction is California hospitals, and they don't want anything going into a hospital that hasn't been proven somehow, and the code required shake testing and or some product certification. So they already had this office set up. So once they started enforcing it, roughly 2006, 2007, then the industry had to catch up right away. But somewhat important to this is that OSHPD only has jurisdiction in California for healthcare facilities. But luckily for them, that's one of the largest markets in the country. So the manufacturers came along kicking and screaming and shooting messengers like myself. Some of you guys might be in the room who shot me once or twice, right, Harold? Anyway, so another jurisdiction is Oregon. They set up a Bureau of Development Services. And they have this paragraph that they will accept pre-qualified components, again, components, equipment, technically they mean equipment, that OSHPD has already certified. Oh, so that makes it easy. So we still technically have one governing body, but then he also said, or other certification agencies accredited by an international accreditation service for product approvals. IAS, International Accreditation Services, is a division of International Code Council which wrote the code. Apologize for all of the acronyms, but this is what it is. And they have now certified agencies that are allowed to certify other manufacturers' product, or product certification agencies. So there are a few out there, and Oregon has decided, well, we'll accept OSHPD, or if you're an IAS certified approved agency to ISO 17065, we'll take that product certification. Nationally, there's no governmental organization that's going to review or put a seal, some kind of stamp on the equipment certification. So it is jurisdictional, and just as John was talking about the AHJs looking at this, that's the same what it is most of the country. The authority having jurisdiction, most of them you know more than, but they have the authority over your equipment going in. And they're just gonna rely on some kind of CFC that came from the credit agency, came from the manufacturer, came from OSHPD. And generally, if you have something, some form of documentation that you did something to meet the code, we see that the local AHJs accept it. California, obviously different. So back to the question, which when I started investigating with some of the people on this committee, all they want to know is, does my motor have to be tested? And as you can tell, it's good news, bad news. HCAI PIN 55, which was OSHPD PIN 55, they actually have a list of equipment that requires special seismic certification. And that's equipment, not components. And again, in kind of ambiguity, motors aren't even listed, but then they're shown as an exemption. How do I have an exemption to something that doesn't even have to exist? So they add to the confusion. So they're an exception to the seismic certification. So you're thinking, okay, so there's an they're not listed and they're accepted. But let's read the exception. Equipment and components not weighing more than 50 pounds, not that many motors, supported directly on structures or surface mounted on equipment. Your motor is exempt if you take your motor and bolt it to building structure. How often do you do that? Not very. Your motor is not bolted to building structure or components that are not required to have special seismic certification. That's a given. If you're 1.0, you don't have to do it. But that supported directly on structures basically says your motor can't be exempt, because your motor, unless it's a garage door opener, you are bolting it to structure. Your motor is a component in a bigger piece of equipment. It's not bolted to structure, it's only bolted to another component. And then there's the 20 horsepower rule. Again, not that many motors fall under the 20 horsepower rule where you're talking the motors to turn some of these bigger fans or water pumps. So it sounds good, but it doesn't. This is what I just discussed on. I put it up here again to repeat that the underlying statement that the motor has to be supported or mounted to structure. And the HVAC system, that even though it's on a heavy structural base, that water pump in the basement is not structured. It's still a piece of equipment. So basically for OSHPD, there is no motor exemption if the motor is an integral part of another component or piece of equipment. But the good thing though, if you do think about it, maybe I'm going a little out of turn here, let me finish the slide. Again, garage door openers, louvers, not HVAC equipment. But your motor needs to be tested, but you may not have to be testing your motor. Your customer is testing your motor. So you are sending your motor to that air handling equipment manufacturer, that pump manufacturer, if they don't make their own motors. And they will be testing your motor. So there is kind of somewhat of a silver lining. It's not your money supporting the test. As a customer service, you may give them the motor to do the testing. But you don't have to do the testing, but the motor still has to be tested. All right, so I'm going to go back to HCAI and the commentary of ASC 7. What about not HCAI? So now OSHPD had their exemptions. So now I'm going to go over what's discussed in ASC 7. There is commentary in ASC 7 that discusses motors being rugged, but it typically limits it to 10 horsepower. Personally, I think a 200 horsepower motor's, spinning a 12-inch water pump, that's also rugged, but the code doesn't believe so. Then there's also empirical data. There's a library of data from the nuclear industry called SQUG. Please don't ask me to know what this acronym means. Jim may know it, I don't know. It recognizes the likelihood of correlating data to be somewhat limited. It says that in the code, and then since the library of data is kind of getting old and manufacturers generally want to update their equipment, there's obviously new ASHRAE standards, new efficiency standards, that the equipment that may have been tested 20 years ago or 30 years ago, put into a nuclear facility, that may have survived an earthquake is not built the same way anymore anyway. So the exemption in ASC 7 for empirical data is also watered down a little bit. But also, now I mentioned ISO 17065. If you read it, that ISO standard, that's for a product certification agency, and that goes through the steps also, not specific to seismic certification, but for product approval, and that's typically accepted nationally. And within, referenced to ISO 1765 is IAS AC 370, which is a product certification agency. That's the acceptance criteria for 17065. I apologize for all the numbers getting thrown out. All right, so I'm still going on the commentary here. One thing to remember, commentary in the building code is not code. It's somewhat there to help you, give you some direction, because there's always questions, so it tries to answer, maybe answer some frequently asked questions, but it is not code per se. And this is where it talks about the greater than 10 horsepower, and 200 MBH excluded again, not knowing that. The exemption for the shake testing on the ruggedness. We know, we repeat it again, the motors are rugged. Components with less motor horsepower and thermal engine are considered to be small and deemed rugged. So it's saying anything more than the 10, right? That's where the 10 horsepower came from. I don't know where the 10 came from, why it's arbitrary somewhat. They're all deemed to be relatively rugged, but again, it's still a component in a piece of equipment. And the experience data, again, it talks about the same thing in there with the commentary, relatively rare with the strong motion, and how do you even get that strong motion that it saw? So your motor may have been in a piece of equipment that survived a great earthquake, but what seismic input did that piece of equipment see? If you don't have that data, you can't correlate it. So once again, you could, but you can't. Now what I'm going to do here is show you a shake test video. I think I've gotten rid of all commercial things on it. And it's a fan wall with small fans and motors. And after you see it, we'll discuss what seems to be obvious. Now that test was done for AC 156, which I mentioned, which is a testing standard. When you're in that room watching your equipment up there being tested, that's the longest 30 seconds of your life. Because you're just waiting for something to fail, something to go flying. But if you look at that, that's a section of an air handling unit with the fan wall. With the heaviest part of that system are your motors. Without the motors in there, you're just shaking sheet metal. So the manufacturer of that equipment cannot certify that piece of equipment without your component inside of it. So once again, your motor has to be tested, but you don't have to test it. The manufacturer of this equipment has to test the motor and put it into his equipment, because also now after the shaking, they have to prove that those fans all worked, that all the air moved the way it was supposed to. And we do some testing without walls for when manufacturers make modular equipment. So not every piece of equipment is tested with walls, which makes it very impressive to watch these things shake back and forth, and you're waiting for something to collapse or fall. You may have seen a few nuts and bolts pop off. That's because when they installed this or took off the walls, they left some hardware on the fan base. And when we saw that, like something broke. No. So I don't know, I know a few people in the room have sat through some of these tests, but this is a very long 30 seconds. All right, so basic, simple conclusion, which we can repeat over and over. Most motors are integral to the non-structural component. And again, the code calls it a non-structural component, but in our parlance, really the piece of equipment, your motor is the component. The testing applies to the larger piece of equipment. HCAI has what's called an OSP program where they will list your equipment if you've met all of their standards, tested to their standards. They'll put it on their website, so you have it listed. It expires every second code cycle, so you can't go past the next building code. Remember that though that is only for California healthcare facilities, most jurisdictions will accept it, but they do not have to. So you could have gone to OSHPA, done your work, spent your tens of thousands of dollars, built your equipment, got it tested, got it certified, go sell it in another seismic area, they don't have to take it. And then ISO 17065 accreditation agencies are allowed to do the product certification. That is, again, typically accepted nationally. A lot of jurisdictions still want to look at it themselves. I don't know of any manufacturer that has gone through either of those that gets rejected, but the AHJ, as always, has the final authority to do whatever they do. Any questions? I'll be willing to hand you the microphone if you don't want to scream.
There's also a microphone.
Oh, there is a mic down there? Okay, good. John didn't see it before. Okay, excellent. All right, well, no questions. Thank you very much.